So this then leads me on to the first speaker of the day. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Luiz Paulo da Moita Lopes, who's the Professor of Applied Linguistics at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and is a researcher for the Brazilian Research Council. Luiz Paulo's most recent book is Global Portuguese, Linguistic Ideologies in Late Modernity, published by Routledge in 2015. But of course, Luiz Paulo's been publishing for a very, very long time indeed, and many of you will be familiar with his work. I first encountered his work in 1995 in a Festschrift for Henry Willison, in which his contribution was called Topic Formulation in L1 Reading Comprehension. But I think he's going to talk about something very different today. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Luiz Paulo. Okay, Luiz Paulo.
I want to start by thanking the organizers, John, Mel, Mike, for putting this series of seminars together for us, and in particular for bringing me all the way from Rio de Janeiro. So this talk is called Queering Language Teaching in Brazilian Schools, a topic we've been involved with for some time now. I'll start with a brief introduction, and I'll discuss why queer, why language, why schools, why Brazil, and then I'll move into, which is the main part of the talk, ethnographic, interventionist, collaborative research, queering language teaching, some pedagogical procedures, guerrilla tactics, entering the field, difficulties, interactional work in classrooms, queer moments and places, and then I'll conclude. Okay. I'm going to start by discussing the title of this talk, Why Queer, Why Language, Why Schools, Why Brazil, so that I can put what I have to say into perspective. So, why queer? As far as I'm concerned, any school subject should be queered, and in fact, any field of knowledge should be queered. If for no other reason, such a view is necessary because there is a tremendous need in our times to think differently or to think otherwise, as Walter Mignolo puts it, if we are to face and understand the world in which we live. As Mignolo, in Post-Colonial Theorizing, points out, the production of knowledge and the need for theories are no longer driven by an abstract and rational will to tell the truth, but also perhaps by ethical and political concerns. We need to construct a narrative. We need to construct a narrative which changes the present, as Koos Van in this very interesting book. I've never met him. Perhaps some of you might have met him. It's a brilliant book published in 2000 called Occidentalism. So he makes this point very clear throughout. He writes the book to make this point. We need to construct a narrative which changes the present. In this sense, queer, a verb, has to do with subverting, denormalizing crystallized ways of thinking, the well-trodden roads, and with questioning what's considered unquestionable. Particularly the narratives we're told about who we are or who we have to be. In this connection, there is a need to be concerned with those who have been historically considered abject, or with the differential distribution of suffering, as Butler puts it, or with which life can be considered life, as Butler again says. As Butler further emphasized, we constitute ourselves politically in the light of the social vulnerability of our bodies as a site of desire and of physical vulnerability as a public site of affirmation and exposure. This is a world which demands more and more reasons for the ways things are said to be like in social life. Such demands are to a large extent due, A, to an overwhelming critique of modernist ideas which have been summarized as a long march to the prison by Zygmunt Bauman, B, to the globalization processes in our digital lives, the world of fluxes of mobility in which we live, and C, to the intense reflexivity in our highly hypersemiotized societies. As the Brazilian geographer Milton Santos says in his book, Toward Another Globalization, for the first time we see humanity, but not universalized, particularly heterosexualized humanity as traditionally thought of when people think of humanity, but humanity as the multitude in hard and negrist terms, the plural singularities the plural singularities of the multitude which contrast with the undifferentiated unity of the people or mass, or different ways of living, different views of the world, and different desires. Or in Paul Beatriz Preciado's terms, in a paper called Multitude Queer, which I'm translating here, in opposition to feminist and homosexual politics, the politics of the queer multitude does not rely on a natural identity, man versus women, neither on the definition of practices, heterosexual, homosexual, but a multiplicity of bodies which refuse the regimes which construct them as normal or abnormal, drag kings, dyke werewolves, beaded women, trans gays without penises, cyborg deficients, ontological games, as Preciado says. What is at play is how to resist or reconvert the forms of sexual political subjectivation. There is no sexual difference, but a multitude of differences, a transversality of power relations, a diversity of life potencies. I want to draw your attention to this concept, life potency, since I'll come back to it later. For the last few years, we've been invited to reconsider several of the categories which have brought us up to here, both in the social sciences and in the humanities. Can you go on living or doing research with universal, transcultural, and transhistorical categories such as class, race, sexuality, gender, family, reproduction, etc., which are now suspect? Can you go on thinking of class, race, gender, and sexuality without considering their intersectionalities and that they have become of the as-if type or zombie categories, as Beck and Beck-Gesheim point out? And above all, can we go on thinking of them without accounting for their performative nature? I understand that whoever we are emerges in discourse performatively, through citation and iterability here and now, mobilizing specific discourse effects. Whoever we are does not derive from an interior essence, but from the effects of our actions and the praxis in which we live. In particular, we need to get rid of heteronormativity and homonormativity at one blow and consider the need to resist any regime of truth about gender, race, and sexuality. As Lynn Siegel, in a quite old paper, says, in consensual sex, when bodies meet, the epiphany of that meeting, its threat and excitement is surely that all the great dichotomies slide away. In his Principles for a Contrasexual Society, which is actually full of humor, as you'll see, Paul Beatriz Preciado points out the contrasexual substitutes for nature. The book is actually called The Contrasexual Manifesto. It appeared, I don't think it has appeared in English, it appeared in Spanish and French. Preciado demands that to avoid the appropriation of bodies as feminine and masculine, every new body should have counter names to escape gender marking. Initially, and with the purpose of destabilizing the heterocentered system, it is possible to choose a name of the opposite sex. I should choose, for example, I should choose to be called Luisa Paula, as Preciado did to herself. She now is called Paul. 2, penises should be replaced with dildos, fingers, cucumbers, etc., to get rid of the centrality of the penis in a heterocentered system. He also argues that the dildo precedes the penis. There is no difference between copy and copied. The dildo is explained through a parodic performativity as gender is. 3, there should be no sex for reproduction, and for rejection of the so-called sexual organs as restricted sites for sexual pleasure. Sexual pleasure should be on the body as a whole. He suggests arm masturbation instead of masturbation of the genitals. As you can see, Paul is quite audacious and funny. I love the arm masturbation bit, and there are lots of drawings, sort of instructing people how to avoid a heterocentered system. We need to construct a queer time and a queer place, as Jack Halberstam says, in schools as well as in other institutions. And in epistemology, which means first, to take into consideration knowledge from what is considered below. Second, truth is of this world, as Foucault points out. Third, interdisciplinarity. I know this, you say interdisciplinarity, but I prefer to say interdisciplinarity. I'm actually coining this word in English, in relation to how we do research and to what we thematize. And fourth, a concern with social practice, suffering, politics, and ethics, and an anti-modernist attitude. I recently had a paper published in some kind of handbook of, in English, and I was criticizing modernist linguistics, and the editor actually put a question mark. She didn't really understand what I meant by modernist linguistics. And of course, I just avoided that issue so that I would get the paper published. But I'm actually coming from Brazil. I'm sick and tired of modernist linguistics. And Boursier, who is this French researcher, says that disciplines are performative in the sense that they construct the object that they purport to describe. And this construction frequently makes use of the heterosexual epistemic regime and excludes queer, between quotes, subjects. The between is my intervention in the text. Subjects and themes from the universities and knowledge in general. Why language? If this is a world in which we do nothing without discourse, the communicative resources made available through whatever we call language, both in the online and on the offline world, are crucial in the performativity of sociality. If this is a world in which we do nothing without discourse, the communicative resources made available through whatever we call language, both in the online and the offline world, are crucial in the performativity of socialities. So making use of language, between quotes, that is, transidiomatic and multimodal communicative resource, to draw attention to the multitudes queer across the globe, or to their performativity, nature, and to their meaning effects in social life is crucial when resisting regimes of truth about sexualities, among others. Also, I think that the indeterminate, ambiguous, and deferred, postponed nature of meaning, as Derrida puts it, in the use of communicative resources, provides any so-called language classroom with the necessary potential for escaping giving meanings about sexualities, genders, and races by exploring their performativities. To exemplify the concept of performativities, I now want to draw attention to the performativities of Ronaldo, the well-known Brazilian footballer, as a matador, both in the football field and as a lady killer, a stud in a narrative told about him in the Rio de Janeiro Daily. As you can see from this, you can't really. But you can see there are lots of cues, linguistic and non-linguistic cues surrounding him. All these women wearing sensual clothes, and Ronaldo himself has his thong sticking out. And I don't have to get time to get into the details of this, the analysis of these linguistic cues, but you can guess the kind of performativity he's portraying, or he's led to do here. Actually exploring the multimodal cues and their indexical metapragmatic meanings is part of what I will call later the use of guerrilla tactics in classroom to draw attention to the performative nature of gender and sexuality in language teaching. However, today we know that Ronaldo has a crush on transvestites. He was caught in a hotel room with 3 transvestites, and as some of you may know, this was in the news globally. As you can see from, this is better. As gatinhas de Ronaldo vêm com uma surpresa. The catties, Ronaldo's catties come with a surprise. And you can guess what kind of surprise that is, right? Here you have a different story which helps to show the performativity nature of sexuality. As we all know, transvestites have penises, the surprise in the paper headlines. So we wonder what the matador was doing with them in a hotel room. Over time, the media can show the unstable nature of sexuality and how it emerges in discourse, escaping given meanings. These media excerpts point out that iterability involves the possibility of change. Why schools? Despite the fact that sexuality have always been an important part of what goes on in schools, it's only recently that research has ethnographically shown the presence in everyday life among students. In this connection, a friend of mine told me that in 1957, in a Brazilian school, he used to masturbate a colleague of his while teachers were teaching. Right there, he was together with the other student masturbating him, and they were both 12 years old. And my friend said that on the last day of class, his colleague, a lover, closed the room door and kissed him in the mouth when they were by themselves in the classroom. It's interesting to see that there have always been room to escape the school panopticon or ways of resisting regularities or regulations in institutional life, or of what I'll call later room for creating a queer time and place. I tell this happy ending anecdote because, as you all know, more goes in schools than teachers feel competent to deal with, certainly not in 1957, and mainly because a lot of suffering still goes on at schools in connection with sexual desire and race, in fact, and social class. I'm sure you're all familiar with terrible narratives of suffering to tell about students who express desire for the same sex in schools. Also, schools are extremely important place for thematizing sexualities. They're usually the first institution children go to outside the reach of their family eyes or outside the family biopolitics. In my school ethnography and literacy context of social practice, I can, for example, illustrate the school panopticon in operation with data derived from focus group interviews. This is a school in the public sector, federally funded with excellent facilities, and the academic standards are high, which is quite exceptional in the Brazilian public sector now. And this narrative, João is I don't have the time to go into it, portrays himself as heterosexual by destroying this particular boy. As you can see, he's line 2, if he spoke like a woman, what would you think, Jeff? This guy must have a problem. And he goes on, line 10, he wiggles his ass, he has a funny voice. No, when I was his age, I wouldn't go somewhere and use that funny voice and wiggle my ass. And the worst thing about it is that he's a gossip. Right, he's a mad queen. The whole thing is interesting because João is a bit older than the other members of the class, but they all sort of collectively support him. And in other stories, João narrates about him being white and male. he occupies this sort of hegemonic position. So there is, in fact, he's telling just one story about what he's like, and at the same time constructing in this narrative about sexuality, Juan, as Foucault would say it, as a member of a species. And I actually I would have never paid attention to this narrative, except for the fact that on the first day in class, I jot down some notes in my diary about this particular boy. They said something about a boy who was a flower or something, but I didn't pay much attention to it. I thought it was kind of male jokes, but it turned out that the whole thing was a lot of the conversation during our focus group interviews were about this particular boy. This paper has been published in English. If you're interested in it, I can give you the reference. But this excerpt certainly calls attention to the fact that some lives are more vulnerable than others, or that some lives are more precarious than others. And this has to do with the way they are politically organized or interpreted, and this has nothing to do with ontology. Why Brazil? Despite the fact that Brazil is officially a secular country, now as never before, as a response to a serious debate in society about LGBTIQ issues, same-sex people can get some kind of marriage, they can adopt children, there is a strong defense in society for the criminalization of homophobia. There is a strong reaction from fascist and religious groups. Although there are representatives in Congress who fight for LGBTIQ causes, and TV shows and soap operas continually discuss such topics, one could say that LGBTIQs do not have an easy life in Brazil. There is a very large contingent of evangelical and Catholic representatives in the Congress who are seriously fighting against our causes, and paradoxically, or perhaps not so, they are actually very active in the Human Rights Commission of the Congress, which is very annoying, more than annoying, very disturbing fact. Contrastively, it's true that I increasingly see same-sex couples holding hands at the university and in the Rio neighborhood where I live. I recently saw the same in Mexico. If you care to know about what's happening in Latin America. Actually, I just got back from Vietnam, and they're having a Vietnam Pride Day this month. There is therefore the need to intervene in classrooms so that we can develop an apparatus to draw attention to the performative nature of gender and sexuality, or at least there is the need to make trouble about gender and sexuality in schools through some kind of guerrilla tactics, as Sullivan says. And these guerrilla tactics are similar to the ones I quickly illustrated by drawing attention to the instability of Ronaldo's sexual desires, or in fact, of any gender, sexuality, or race labels. As you know, the race issues are actually part of the queer agenda. The idea was behind our project was to create queer moments or queer times and places at school in which a vital, sedimented, corporeal discursive performance can be somehow undermined by showing how gender, sexuality, and race are performative. So we now move into the interventionist collaborative research section of my talk. How am I doing time-wise? Okay. This is actually research in collaboration with my wonderful colleague, Branca Falabella Fabricio. You may you may see some of her work in the King's College working papers. She's been doing wonderful work. So I work with her. Our aim was to imagine, to inaugurate new meanings about gender and sexuality in 5th grade classrooms, or to destabilize crystallized views of these socialities through the use of some kind of pedagogic discourse analysis. A quite audacious thing to do with 10, 11-year-olds, as you can imagine. We designed a school year ethnographic interventionist collaborative research project in which the teacher co-participated in the design of the syllabus with us, and Branca co-taught the classes with the teacher. The theoretical basis involved Foucault, theorization, biopolitics, biopower, queer theories, denormalizing given essentialized meanings, literacies as social practices, literacies as practices in which we do things to one another, positioning theory. When we engage in discourse, we position ourselves towards other people, to the themes of the things we're talking about, to the characters in the narratives we tell. And in lexicality theory, with the aim of creating a teaching approach which could destabilize ossified meanings and therefore collaborate with the exploration of life potencies. So, you know, the queer, the queer multitudes. Some of the pedagogical procedures included issues related to meaning, ambiguity, indeterminacy, and of course using this ambiguity to show the indeterminate nature of sexuality, gender, and race in the syllabus. We tried to historicize these concepts, queering sexuality, gender, and race, trying to treat all of these, all of them together, and drawing attention to their instability. Used a variety of text and media images which had the potential to destabilize essentialized meanings, like the ones of Ronaldo I've just shown. Used a variety of genres to draw attention to semiotic action. Stimulated pupils to reflect on meaning effects produced by different linguistic cues, pragmatic reflexivity. He negotiated new interaction rules in classrooms. Instability in all senses was the norm rather than certainty. Now, entering the field was quite a difficult task, but our way was facilitated by the cis female teacher who was very interested in the project and very much respected by the school community. Otherwise, we wouldn't have managed to get into the field. We got parents' consent. They knew we were talking about these topics. The difficulties, no, that's okay, it's okay, came from, particularly from male members of the school staff who were very much worried about whether we're doing the right thing, and also from one cis male school technician who was helping us with the project, and he was evangelical and actually questioned the teacher directly about whether she should discuss these issues in classroom. Also, I must say, when some of this research was published, it was classified as unsettling and provocative. Fortunately, that's the reason why it got published. We found the right editor. A lot of people in the academic world still look at us as if we're coming from a different planet, both nationally and internationally, I must say. However, at this point in my career, I do whatever I want. And here, Rodrigo Bova, who is helping me with this presentation, actually Dr. Rodrigo Bova, is a member of our project and is just finished his PhD on wonderful work on transsexual, work in ethnography in a transsexual clinic. So we are not, we're working very hard to advance our work and to make people read our work. We are doing more and more research on sexuality, race and gender and social class on the online and the offline world in Brazil. But now let's look at how these procedures may be illustrated with some of the interactional work that went on in the classrooms. We did have some tasks, but what I thought was the most interesting part was of our work is how we think of this course and how we interact with students, and through this interaction, how we make them think of gender and sexuality and race through a different perspective, or at least familiarize them with the traditional ways of thinking of these so-called categories. In the data, as you see, don't expect to see anything magnificent. So tremendous changes. No. This is a long way process. But from the data, you can see that there is these are very young kids. There is the possibility of constructing a different world with these children. This is a different school from the first excerpt. But it's also part of the federal system, which again means good school. But listen, the question is, can we say that every behavior this is the researcher, Branca, speaking, and the teacher says that everybody's the same, that everybody's like that? No, people collectively. If he has a cat, he's gay. If he has a dog, this is a label. And Carlos says, I have a dog. And then the pupils collectively, they all talk at the same time, and it's difficult to understand what they say. And Francisco, looking at the teacher who was near him, says, Miss, I have about 30 Playboy magazines, and I don't spend all my time looking at them. And the teacher then intervenes, hey people, this is becoming difficult, you're talking too much. If in fact she's saying, using a label that every is like that, he who is not gay has to be different. So every heterosexual doesn't enjoy working on his books or cleaning the house. Is that right? And João says, I like working on my books. This interaction shows the difficulties faced when we try to denaturalize genders and sexualities with 10, 11 years old, and for that matter, with most people. And how carefully one has to go. This finding of this piece of research draw attention to quite essentialized views, but we began to see some subtle changes in operation, as shown when João interactionally positions himself towards the interactional topic. I like working on my books. We can at least say that pupils can be taken in to reposition themselves in the direction of innovative meanings, and indexical cues, references are what is aimed at here. As you can see, we believe that it's through the interactional work and through a particular view of discourse as the main pedagogical tool. Except two, the researcher, Branca, shows the picture of a Marlboro cigarette. Which idea does this picture show? A picture of this propaganda of Marlboro cigarette. Francisco says he's a cowboy. And Clara, the picture shows that he's strong, a cowboy. The teacher, but is every cowboy strong? This one here doesn't seem to be strong. And pupils, yeah, no. And the research, and football players are strong. Yes. And the researcher shows the picture of David Beckham advertising perfume. What about this one? And Francisco, David Beckham, he wears women's underwear. Luiz, he's gay. No, he's not gay, he's vain. And Clara, on the street where I live, there is a boy who paints a little flower on his nail, you know. But is it normal? Mariana says. Clara, yes. The teacher shows a picture of men wearing skirts. What can you say about this picture, Francisco? They are wearing skirts. But here's a rock singer. It's okay to wear skirts, but not women's underwear. So here you can see that they start sort of challenging common sense ideas about gender and sexuality, and you see some kind of destabilization of very solidified discourses. So the use of these different images index different types of discourses about so-called cis masculinities. So the borders of normality are blurred, but by the very examples the pupils bring about. And these signals a reflexive stance on their part. Just briefly. Okay. The last excerpt. What we can conclude, this is the teacher speaking, so what we can conclude about what has been said so far, it's a question. Is it easy to label women and men? And the pupils, no, but we use labels. For example, men are stronger than women are sensitive. And Clara, yes, we learn from our parents that men are more aggressive and that women are more caring. Maria, a couple has two children, a boy and a girl, and they're the same age. The boy falls off his bike and his father says, stand up and don't cry because men don't cry. And Clara, and the father says that men don't cry, but they do cry. And that's Eric saying. And the teacher, do you think the mothers differentiate between sons and daughters? Eric, boys are spoiled. Clara, my whole family comes to party in our place on Sundays. Then my father or my mother says to their son, you go and play football, and you, my daughter, come and help me clear the dishes. There is a difference. What we see now is the critical, collective, interactional positioning of pupils who produce what we think are queer moments, and they provide examples of the discursive order which orient their performativities, problematizing the essentialist differences between genders. They seem to produce some understanding about the performative nature of their socialities. They have got involved with the family practice of genders and sexualities from a less stereotypical logic, constituting a mosaic of meanings which are fragile and momentary, signaling a high degree of local performativity. We may say that the guerrilla tactics used by both the teacher and the researchers may have mobilized these meanings. Obviously, it's not a cause and effect relationship. The scaffolding discursive strategies used involve support and challenge and consist of continual discursive attacks on common sense. So naturalized meanings are at least locally questioned. So my point again is that through this scaffolding is done through the way we contrive interaction between the teacher and the researcher and the pupils. So the effects of these meanings in classrooms are very subtle and local, and also we are not claiming that they will be reproducible in other contexts. A final word. Queer moments and places can be created in classrooms with the hope of dismantling the heterosexual, homosexual logic, trying to disrupt the social cultural regulations which provide heteronormativity with substance. The mobilization of meanings occurs amidst rupture and permanence of interactional positionings. However, despite these oscillatory movements, the new meanings about gender and sexualities, when supported collectively by the teacher, the researcher, and pupils, may signal micro-resistances. The fact that these micro-resistances take place on the very solidified discursive terrain may indicate the potentiality of the strategic creation of queer moments and places towards the inauguration of new meanings about who we can be, since they have a high degree of performativity in the educational context. Finally, we also believe that the creation of these queer places and times and the use of communicative resources stimulate the contemporary need of thinking otherwise, or the need of refusing giving meanings, and of stimulating life potencies or the queer multitudes. We think this is a way of helping to resist what Beck and Beck-Gersheim has called zombie categories in everyday life. They are talking about zombie categories in the academic world, but there are a lot of zombie categories in everyday life which we should get rid of. We think that these guerrilla tactics politicize our social practices involving epistemic and ethical gains. That is, the inauguration of new ways of thinking otherwise, epistemic gains, and understanding that all lives are grievable and that suffering should not be understood as differently distributed. Ethical gains. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. It's really, really interesting. You mentioned earlier in your talk that there was a resistance or difficulties from the definition based on evangelical belief. How did you deal with the resistance? And second point that is buzzing in my brain, I'm not sure I understand what the pedagogical guerrilla tactics are. If you could just give me an outline, I'd be really interested.
Yeah, we did, as I said, the main guerrilla tactics is using discourse itself, because methodology, as far as I understand it, is basically an interactional thing. And the way we constrict, we conceive of discourse and how we work interactionally with the students. Of course, we had tasks such as, puzzles in which they had to wonder about which word would go here or there, in relation to classes and gender and sexuality, and also things such as things that men do, things that women do, and making them reflect on this. But in other presentations, I've shown these tasks, and we also got them at the end of this academic school year to construct stories and in relation to the topics we discussed throughout the school year. And we got some very interesting, because these kids are very good about drawing, and there was some excellent narratives and produced.
And how did you deal with the resistance?
Sorry?
How did you deal with the resistance?
The resistance on the part, it was difficult, particularly from the staff. But as I said, the teacher was very much on our side, and because she was also very much respected by the community, and despite the fact that particularly the male teachers resisted, were critical of what she was doing, well, we just went ahead, and we were very fortunate to have her, because the principal supported her as well. And it was a very specific kind of environment, I must say. And the school technician was the one that was in the classroom, and he was openly evangelical. And this is actually a quite difficult thing we're going through in Brazil, facing there is a tremendous, enormous groups of evangelicals, Brazilian churches, which are actually found all over the world, but founded in Brazil. We are very good at doing this. Okay.
Much. Thank you for your very insightful talk. Sort of to make a link to the question that we have just heard, I was wondering how did you kind of sell your project to the parents of these children, who I assume had to give their consent, right?
Yeah, that is also difficult. We told them through send them a letter saying that because we had to get their consent, that we're going to be discussing issues related to gender, sexuality, and race. And no one was against it. And we were lucky. I think it has to do with the teacher. You know, she could have retired, but she loves and she doesn't need the money, and she loves I just gave a talk recently in a bookshop in Rio, actually when this Preciado's book was launched in Rio, the Contrasexual Manifesto, and she came. And she was doing a new project related to African Brazilian religion. You know, this is really, it's almost as if the world is upside down. You don't do this in schools, particularly when there is tremendous reactionary views in society against this particular kind of religion, African Brazilian religions.
Seems to me one of the ways you could think about your method is taking something monologic, which is like a sort of heteronormative assumptions, and creating dialogue. You're getting dialogue, and that's what
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and while doing this, provoking, bringing up issues which make them, make the students sort of develop a reflexive attitude towards their saying. I think Courtney Kasdan, in her wonderful book, a very old book, probably most of you never heard of her book, Classroom Discourse, right? It has been reprinted. Wonderful. 2000. She drew attention to the it's not, I can't think of the word, but it's the relevance of discourse, how discourse can, you know, when you come to, it's something that happens to me all the time. Then I think of Courtney Kasdan. You get involved with someone, and you can't think of a particular, you are doubtful about a particular thing, and just because you got involved with this course, she has a wonderful word to name this. I'm sorry, I wish I could remember this, because it's the force of discourse itself that makes you to the creative force of discourse. But she has a wonderful word, which I forget things these days.
Some of your data it reminded me of work that I've seen done using Freirean-inspired problem posing, using codes and things. I wondered what you thought about.
I didn't get what you said.
Some of your classroom data reminded me of work that I've seen done, which was inspired by Paulo Freire, which is the problem posing.
I see, Paulo Freire.
Problem posing codes, using codes and so on. I was just wondering what you thought about Freire's.
Well, yeah, Paulo Freire is when it comes to thinking about discourse, and of course you could say also that some of these ideas are also related to critical discourse analysis and stuff like that, yeah. And basically bringing their own world and the media, things they are familiar with, to classrooms so that they can reflect on them. But this is, as as you know, this is very unusual. You know, these are non-topics. There are still non-topics in the academic world. You know, in schools, these are still very difficult issues to deal with. Teachers avoid. In another project, well, it's not their fault, really. It's our fault. We don't talk about these things. Although it's part of the national curriculum, diversity, considering sexual issues, and in schools, teachers in universities are not prepared to face this sort of, and teachers avoid them. I've actually asked in my previous research the teacher, why didn't you, when she asked the students, please could you talk about, I asked her to deal with prejudice. And the class was about prejudice. They read a text and discussion and all kinds of things and language exercises, you know, the typical classroom. And a typical class. And one student brought up the issue of homosexuality, and as a possible area he could talk about. She asked them to write a paragraph or something. And she said, her answer was, if you're going to talk about this issue, or if you're going to get into this sort of thing, I don't think you understood what we're talking about. So, and I asked her, why did you do this? And she said, well, I felt very insecure, I didn't know what to say, and so it's actually our fault. And I mean, I come from a school of letters, right? And we're still, the whole program is basically, except for Rodrigo and you know, those of us and Branca and I who work in, I guess, perhaps the three of us, and we teach undergraduate courses. But basically, the whole university is still talking from a structuralist paradigm. So society, perhaps you get the odd teacher, lecturer in Portuguese language, but not in linguistics. All structuralists and quantitative social linguistics. They're very good and very well known internationally. And so I think it's actually what we as lecturers in the academic world are doing. Yeah. Well, it's published, yeah, some of it, the interventionist part is published in Portuguese, a couple of papers. But the other, the sort of more descriptive of what's going on was published in 2006 in this book by Defina, Narrative Analysis, Discourse and Identity, I think, just Schifrin and Defina and Bamberg. Discourse and Identity, I think. Discourse and Identity, Cambridge University Press, right?
Okay, thank you. I think it's time for other questions in line.
Yes, you mentioned prejudice just now.
I mentioned what?
Prejudice.
Uh-huh.
And saying how people are not used to dealing with prejudice. Can you recall the way in the research that you carried out how that very experienced teacher challenged homophobia, transphobia, and biophobia? Was that just through the guerrilla tactics and getting them to reflect, or did she or they have any additional strategies that they use?
No, we didn't in this project. We didn't really get into transphobia. We basically were homophobia. Yeah. How did she dealt with it? Trying to deconstruct the idea of homophobia. showing that it's a construct or that it's unstable. Like you get Ronaldo, there is nothing more macho than Ronaldo, and next thing you see is Ronaldo is sleeping with three. Is that Kathy? Oh, wonderful to see you. I'm sorry. I haven't seen you for such a long time. I couldn't help saying that. But going back, there is nothing more macho than Ronaldo, and to show him, performing a different kind of masculinity, it's just it just destroys completely the idea of a macho or hegemonic masculinity is like, or at least makes people, students, pupils of that age, wonder about the stories they've been told, or the kinds of stories they have to fit, the kinds of narratives they have to fit.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that.
Thank you.